Welcome to Life L'Chaim. On today's show, we'll talk with Jim Davis, the religion reporter for the Florida Sun-Sentinel newspaper. And first up is Holocaust survivor Nathan Taffel. Right after these messages.
Nathan, tell us about your life.
Well, I was born in Poland. My father and mother were farmers. They had 7 daughters and 2 sons. And since they could not find any Jewish spouses for the 7 daughters, so decided to leave the farm and lease the farm out and move to the city called Radomish Wielki in Poland, naturally, where I was born. And I was the youngest of 10 children. During the course of time, which I don't remember, I think I was 6 months old, one of my brothers moved to Argentina. So he was at that time 21 years old. I didn't know where, what, being a young child or anything. And living in Radomish, life, it was, the Semitism was there, you know, the high holidays. They would come out, the Gentiles from the church, and they would break Jewish windows, beat up Jews, and so forth, especially on Christmas and Easter time. But you live with it, and you get used to it, and you think that's the way life is. In school, which was next door to my house, and my house was the big house, and I would constantly call Jew, and you live with that. And as a child, I didn't understand why. So after a while, the war broke out.
And when did the Nazis come to your town? How old were you?
1939, I think it was approximately 11, maybe 11 and a half or 12. I'm going back to the day of my bar mitzvah, more or less, which I didn't have, except my father told me at one time to read a part of it. If anything happened, he assumed that at least that I read part of it, the bar mitzvah part or something. But so I gathered I must have been about 11 and a half or 12, maybe a little older. So when the war broke out and we heard the Germans approaching the town, they had steel plates. You could hear them from a long distance. And we were in the basement, my father and mother and my sisters. And my father and I walked up when the Germans knocked at the door. And we opened the door, and my father said something to one of the Germans, and they stopped beating him up. And I was devastated. I cried to see your father getting beaten up, and that was the beginning of the atrocities. From there on, the Germans occupied Radomish, and the SS would come in, and then Jewish people, the Orthodox Jewish people, had facial hair. They would burn their hair. They would beat them up, and they would shoot a lot of them and so forth. Since I was not 13 years of age, I did not have to wear a Star of David like most of all the Jews in the city had to wear a Star of David on the left hand. So I wasn't 13, so I didn't. So I was in the street watching around what's going on. And they would come on different occasions and come in and search in the houses. Anything of any value, anything important, like fur, silver, gold, money, or anything at all, liquor even, anything, they would turn the house upside down and they would take it away. And Jewish kids could not go to school anymore. They weren't allowed to go to school. And life completely changed. As a child, the adults knew the atrocities of what's happened in Germany and so forth. But every time I tried to listen into the conversation, they would stop and tell me to go and play or do something or go do some other stuff. So in reality, I didn't know exactly what was going on.
So when were you separated from your family?
I was separated from my family I think it was in either 41, and that was in the ghetto in Tarnów. And the separation was very traumatic to me then and today.
And your 7 sisters, tell us about them.
3 of my sisters were married, and they lived out of town. And 4 sisters were at home, and they were in the labor camps. And I joined them from the ghetto after a while with my youngest sister. And then we worked for a year. After that, we arrived in Mielec. We found my brother was there working already. And he was telling us what happened to the city people, the Jewish people in Radomish, that everybody was eliminated. And they said that he told us the women that wouldn't give up the babies, they were killing the babies, hitting them against the wall. The people had to dig their own graves. And there was one truck that they had that was having a big window in the back. And that truck, they put in people that couldn't walk or they were disabled or mentally sick or whatever. They put them there and they hooked up the exhaust system and poisoned them.
And what about your parents?
My parents were in Tarnów ghetto. I found out after the war, my oldest brother-in-law, who I was with in Tarnów, survived, but not my sister. And he was telling me that they were shot in Tarnów, in the ghetto, because they were older people and they couldn't, for one reason or another, be taken to the gas chambers. I don't know. My other sisters, like I said before, were in Treblinka. They were gassed with their children. And then my brother and I and 4 sisters were in Mielec, labor camp. We repaired airplanes, and then they started liquidating. And so they took the men and put them on trains, and the women stayed behind. My sisters, we had never a chance to say goodbye or nothing. And we were taken to Flossenburg. They stayed behind. And what happened to them, I didn't know, because there was no goodbye, there was no nothing said. But later on, through the years, I found that I had a brother in Argentina. For my oldest brother-in-law told me I had a brother in Argentina. And I got in touch with him later on in my life.
Welcome back to L'Chaim. We're in the studio with Nathan Taffel, the author of Stolen Childhood, that documents his life during the Holocaust. Nathan, in our earlier segment, you mentioned that retelling the story is very painful, but you've chosen to do so in Stolen Childhood. Tell our audience more about the details of your life that they're going to read about in the book.
Well, they're going to read about my days that I can remember as a 12-year-old and continuation to where I am today. And it all details the atrocities and the happiness and the good times and bad times in that book. But in reality, I did not express myself in the book as much as I do when I speak to children, because it takes much longer. And I also would like the people to know what's happening to my family, and that is in the book.
Now, in the book, you speak about the miracles that happened to you along the way, that you were able to avoid German bullets and selection and extermination. Tell us about that in the book.
Well, when the Gestapo came to Radamish, and there was the day before the liquidation of the city of the Jewish people, I didn't realize it, and I was driving my bike, and two Gestapos yelled out, stop, and I didn't. And they took their guns out to shoot me. My brother, who happens to be selected to help the Germans with digging graves and so forth, and amongst other people. So he saw that in the window in the building, and he came out and pleaded, and they let me go. On another occasion, I was in a labor camp, and there were no young people and no old people. They just took him in the forest and they shot him. And one of the foremen saved my life. I've had different occasions that I was saved by working very hard, and I was very strong as a young person, and I don't think my time was up. I always attribute my survival to my mother in heaven.
And the book also talks about your life after the Holocaust. Tell me, after you were liberated, where did you go to? How did you make your way finally to America?
Well, I was liberated, and we lived in a city called Schwandorf, Germany. My brother went back to hometown, Radamish, stayed there for a period of time till the natives scared him and made him leave. They didn't want to lose the home. And he waited to see if there are any survivors in the family. And then he came back, and I must have been about 18 and a half or 18 at that time. And he came back and he said nobody survived except the two of us. And then I developed a hate. I hated so much I couldn't sleep at night. I couldn't function really. I wanted so badly to get a gun and go out and shoot and kill the people that destroyed my family that it became an obsession with me, the hate. Then one day I came to the conclusion, if I live with hate for the rest of my life, it will destroy me like it destroys other hate people. So from there on I decided I will not hate. Hate is not in my vocabulary. As far as I'm concerned, no matter what, I don't hate.
So the book
also mentions the hate part.
So the book documents that part of your life, and your brother survived with you after the Holocaust?
My brother survived. And my brother developed psychological problems because he watched the people in Radamish getting shot, babies getting killed, and tremendous atrocities that he had to participate by burying them. And he developed a mental problem, and he died at a young age.
And the book talks about also your life as a child. How do you think an American child living in the world that we live in now, how do you think they relate to your book? Do you think they can really grasp this terrible, dark message that the book contains?
I found that I've talked to so many schools and high schools and temples and parochial schools and so forth. I've talked to so many different places that I make a persuasion about hate, and I tell the children that the most important thing in their life is the family and the educators. And the response that I received in letters is so beautiful, so wonderful, so valuable to me, more than any money they could give me. And I have a tremendous persuasion about hate, and
So the book
covers the part.
The book has helped you live with the memories, and I would like to ask you, what is the one message when the person starts the book, reads through it, and closes the book again? What's the one message you want them to take away from that book?
That they shouldn't hate. Hate does not have any purpose, any value whatsoever.
Well, let me ask you, based on the book and your life, do events going on in the world scare you now? Do you think the world's getting scarier or safer?
Yes. What annoys me more than anything else, that I believe in God. Every religion believes in God. Yet the people kill each other for no reason whatsoever.
Nathan, I want to thank you for being with us today. You've given the audience a lot to think about. Again, I remind our viewers, the book Stolen Childhood, you can order it at nathantaffel.com and share Nathan's story, which is well worth reading. Nathan, thank you again for being with us. With us today is James Davis, the religion editor and senior reporter of the Sun-Sentinel newspaper in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Jim, thanks for being with us today. We appreciate you coming into the studio and sharing 30 years of experience in journalism. And I want to focus today on your role as a religion editor. Have you always written about religious articles, religious issues?
No, when they first hired me out of college, the Sun-Sentinel company, I was with the Fort Lauderdale News, the morning paper. I spent 14 months as a general lifestyle reporter. And then I wrote some religion stories, and then when the religion reporter with the newspaper was cycled on to the plantation, they asked me to become the religion writer.
I see. So was it a particular interest of yours, or it was just an assignment?
It was. I've always thought that spirituality deserved to have some interest in a secular medium, because spirituality influences so many things we do, think, say, hidden motives behind the way politics and social action and even entertainment runs. You know.
So over the past 30 years, as you've watched religion, how has it evolved? How have those stories evolved? Do you think religion has changed in 30 years?
Oh, absolutely. Religion is more into media now. Religion is more out on the streets and in academia. The odd thing is that although there is less attendance now in churches and synagogues and mosques, there is more spirituality out in the streets and in popular media. And
one of your tasks is to report on the Jewish community as well as all of the other faith communities. Have you found that reporting Jewish news demands anything extra of you, or any special secret touch that you've developed?
Oh, secret touch. Well, I wish I could say I had a formula, but I don't. What I find helps with any group that's not part of the mainstream, although Judaism really has evolved into the mainstream, especially in South Florida, which is one of the biggest Jewish areas in the world. But I find that respect, courtesy, a willingness to learn, an interest, conveying the effort to want to report things as they see them as well as get a broader interest that will help other readers to understand their position. I find that happens, that's a value of a lot of different people of different religions.
But how do you keep a balance of reporting on Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever other denominations or religions come across your desk? How do you strike a balance to keep the public happy?
Oh, I found that some religion writers do keep a balance where they'll try to have in each issue certain religions and certain ethnic groups. I find that hard to do in South Florida because there are so many different religions and ethnic groups here. I usually go by the rhythm of the season. You know, in the wintertime, for instance, there's a lot of Jewish news. You know, in the summertime, not so much because so many Jews are snowbirds and they'll go up north. You know, other times around Easter, Passover time, there'll be a lot of Christian Jewish news. Around Ramadan time, of course, there will be a lot of Islamic news.
Yeah, let's talk about that a minute, because Islam has emerged like never before. Do you find yourself constantly having to re-educate to cover Islamic stories or Muslim stories that 10 years ago no one even knew about?
I find myself re-educating myself on everything all the time. Whether it's Baha'is or Hindus or Buddhists. You might have picked up Muslims just because they've been in the news so much lately, both good and bad things. But in fact, I wrote my first story on Islam around Ramadan of 1975.
Oh.
I've revisited it periodically. So they pretty much know me in the community. But again, I do it with the same formula. I go in to try to understand their position and then to report on all sides of an issue.
And how has the new media, electronic media, Twitter, Facebook, web pages, how does that affect your reporting?
Oh, it's affected it heavily. I have to familiarize myself on different platforms. I began writing a blog in 2008. I was an internet reporter in 1998 when the Sun-Sentinel first ventured onto the web. On the other hand, the speed of the reporting has increased a lot. I will often write for a breaking story first on the web and then develop it in print. And sometimes it'll go the other way too. I'll write a short version in print and then develop it further on the web where there's no space restrictions.
And how do you develop, let's say, a Jewish story? Do you follow national news and then try to localize it? Or do you find most of your time is spent on local issues?
Well, that's another way the internet has affected reporting. The Sun-Sentinel in particular, and a lot of other papers that want to survive, have decided that the local angle is their franchise. So my stories increasingly have become local, although I always try to work in a national or international angle on it. Because, of course, what happens here is affected by what's happened around the world, and vice versa, too.
I see. I know you've written, because I always follow your stories, a lot on interfaith dialogue. That has to be one of your big responsibilities. How has that changed, do you think, in 30 years? The amount of interfaith dialogue and where it goes now that it perhaps never did before?
It has increased a lot, and people of different faiths are now being brought into it. Before, interfaith dialogue used to mean Jews and Christians. But for instance, an organization that began here in South Florida, which is now national, is Jamadal, which used to be called Jews and Muslims. It began after 9/11. Jews and Muslims in this area decided they needed to understand each other in order to keep the community peaceful. Then they brought in other people, Christians and Buddhists and other people. So I believe the variety of interfaith contacts has increased, and so has the quality of them. People are no longer just talking tea and sympathy, as you used to call it. They're talking about issues and what's the facts behind them.
So what are the hard issues that they're talking about that you're reporting on?
The hard issues are prejudice toward each other. The hard issues are, for instance, questions on whether Islam requires an intolerance, questions on whether Christian theology still supports anti-Semitic thoughts. So we're getting into more harder issues rather than just
superficial smiling at each other.
Yeah, exactly.
And tell me, what do you think, after 30 years, can you look back and say there's been one story that was your favorite or more significant or that you'd like to revisit 30 years later?
Oh, I often revisit stories after years later. I did a religious review of Star Wars, the movie, in 1977. And I emphasized its connections with traditional Christianity. By 1997, the 20th anniversary, when George Lucas did the retooled version, I revisited it again, and I'd learned more myself about religion and spirituality, and I noticed the similarities with Taoism and Buddhism. So, favorite stories, I wouldn't say that, because it would be like, what's your favorite child? It would be more like my favorite kind of story. My favorite kind of story would be looking at a national, international trend, finding local examples, getting scholarly opinions on it, and hopefully working in a little of my own analysis.
Very good. Jim, I want to thank you for being with us today. We appreciate your insights for ourselves and for our listeners. Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
Keep on writing.
I shall.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition. Don't forget to visit our Facebook page for all the latest news about our program. I'm Lee Lazarson. Thanks for joining us on To Life L'Chaim.